Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Afikra Book Club. Our special guest today is Sabrina Mahfouz, and we're talking about her book, These Bodies of Water. Sabrina is a writer and performer raised in London and Cairo, and she is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and a resident writer at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. She's written and performed and published an enormous amount. We are excited to be able to dive deeply into These Bodies of Water. Sabrina, welcome.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone.
So let's jump into the first thing I said, which is that you work across multiple art forms: film, TV, opera, dance, music, and that it doesn't even include the work that you've done outside of the arts. So let's go back to the sort of teenage Sabrina. What did the teenage Sabrina think that she would be doing right about now?
Oh, good question. Probably I would have liked to have imagined I was writing, but I didn't really think that was realistic. So I actually thought that I wanted to be an archaeologist, or work in like actually in museum curation, because like back then there was zero talk within that kind of industry, or it felt like it anyway to a young teenager like myself at the time, around repatriation and decolonizing a sort of museum industry. And so I really wanted to work within that, and I thought like being an archaeologist might lead to that, and that I'd be able to sort of push that kind of agenda. But then I was really bad at archaeology because I didn't realize it had so much to do with maths. It's very scientific, and I kind of I think I thought it was just going to be like really fun excitement, so that didn't really work out. But I did do some work experience in archaeology departments in London. So that's probably what I thought I was going to be doing, if not something to do with parties and raving, because that was a large part of my teenage life as well.
You were good at that part.
Yeah.
It reminds me of my nephew Alex. Yesterday I was talking to him and I said, "Hey, so how's math class going this year?" He's like, he's about like 7-8 years old. "How's math class going this year? You used to want to be a mathematician." He looked at me, he's like, "No, as it turns out, I don't like math." It's like, I just realized I don't like it.
That's when he was doing like addition. He was like, yes,
he was like,
I'm gonna be a mathematician.
Yeah. But let's get into some of the, so you started writing and you're interested in writing, but from what I understood from the book and from what I understand about you, you've done many different things. And the book covers this idea of you going into government service, going into a public service. Can you give a little context about that decision? When was this decision? Where were you at the time? And why did you sort of venture down that path?
Yeah, I suppose I have always had some would probably think of it as a naive ideation of public service and sort of what it can be, and what people who go into it want it to be and try to make it be, in that it actually really is a public service, that you are trying to make what is definitely going to be a bad set of circumstances as good as you can, for the people who it's going to be servicing. And it did feel like the civil service is the place where you can do that. I didn't have, I wasn't completely naive to the fact that it wasn't going to be, I didn't agree with most of the things that the government do, etc. But I wanted to be someone in the room who was able to put forward different perspectives when those decisions were being made on policy, and hope that in that little way you can kind of make a difference. And also, I was part of this government graduate scheme, so it was a sort of fast track career trajectory. So that was also appealing to me, ambition wise, just that you could kind of have this training, quite intense training over a few years, and become senior at something, and I don't know, that was just appealing. And I think, I had actually wanted to work in the arts prior to that, but it was so closed. And I found it really, really difficult at the time, not knowing anybody, not having any family connections or any sort of money to pay for like big courses and things like that. It felt like a really closed world. And eventually I ended up finding a gap in which it wasn't closed in performance poetry. But at the time when I applied for the civil service, I hadn't found that. So weirdly, government and civil service seemed more of an accessible, open avenue to pursue if you were trying to do something that felt like it had some kind of point to it, and it had a sort of greater meaning to it on the day-to-day level.
Yeah. So when you went into performance poetry, was there always sort of professional ambition behind it from the beginning, or sort of maybe not professional ambition, which is to say that, this is where I would, make my money and pay my bills, but were you always interested in sort of excellence and really like honing your craft and trying to get better, or were you using that outlet to sort of just find yourself and do something that you really enjoyed and loved?
It's such a good question. I definitely didn't see it as something that could be professionally pursued at the time. I was actually paying to do it. Like at first it was
the fake open mics.
Yeah, open mics, and so paying £5, and if you weren't paying £5, you were paying for like the drinks and whatever else it came with. So it was it definitely wasn't something that I thought of as a moneymaker, but I did see it as a way to hone the craft, I suppose, and particularly a performance craft, and what writing specifically for performance was, because I'd only ever really done that in my head until I actually performed. I was imagining what it would sound like, but I didn't really know what it felt like. And then once you have that interaction with the audience, and the energy was from the stage to the crowd, realizing how that worked, and trying to, manipulate that for the best sort of outcome, but also tell the stories that you want to tell, get people to listen to stuff that otherwise they might have felt quite uncomfortable to listen to package all that up into 2-3 minutes, whatever it is that you're usually allowed. I think was a really good education in kind of having to strive to achieve something with quite limited boundaries, because at the time when I was doing it, I don't think it is the same now, but you really did have timed slots, and you had to finish by that point, otherwise you'd have to get off the stage. And so there's quite a lot of things that you were trying to hit, whilst also making sure that you were staying true to like your voice and telling the kind of stories you wanted to tell. So that's how I saw it at first, and then it was only because people started saying, why don't you think about theatre, because I was doing a lot of characters within the poems. And then theatre became something that all of a sudden was this like professional world, where everybody who was into it was like definitely thinking of it as something that they were ambitious about in terms of a career. So, and then people started to pay me tiny amounts of money to write these small theatre pieces. So then that kind of changed the perspective on what I was doing. And actually, this might be a real course for work.
Yeah. Is it one of those things where it's you realized, oh, this is who I've been all along. I've actually had these thoughts and these stories, and I've been performative in this very specific way, and I finally found my venue. I finally sort of found my tribe. Or were you like, oh, cool, this is just an interesting vehicle for me to adapt to, but it could have been something else first?
It was definitely the first one. It was, I had a few pieces of writing that would not have fit anywhere else. I mean, they didn't fit anywhere else. If I'd have which I had like sent them to places to be published. It would be like, what on earth is this? They didn't fit in theatre at the time. They didn't fit anywhere. So just finding this space where people were like that weird and surreal, and it wasn't initially when I was doing it, it wasn't actually a kind of politically sort of stand on stage and do a kind of political campaign poem that existed, but the ones that I was going to at the start were much more like surreal storytelling, which was what I'd had, and thought that they were just going to be like my own little stories that I just did for myself. So to kind of stand there and be like, wow, there's all these other people who also do all these weird stories and voices to go with them, and get claps at the end of it,
or snaps.
Yeah. No, we didn't do snaps in London. That came a bit later, I think, but we were definitely behind America with those things. And it was amazing to be like, this is the place, and this place exists. And it completely changed my opinion of what was possible and what I wanted to do.
So I want to jump into These Bodies of Water for a second. And I didn't actually read the full title. The full title is These Bodies of Water, Notes on the British Empire, the Middle East, and Where We Meet. But the reason why I'm reading the full title is because this in many ways is an adaptation of a stage show called The History of Water in the Middle East. So I guess my first question is, why the new title?
Well, partly because it kind of has to be, because just for the different industries and mediums, A History of Water in the Middle East was very much a like 60-minute zoom through the history of Britain in the Middle East, and with sprinklings of like my own story threaded through to just keep the narrative framed in that hour. Whereas These Bodies of Water is much more expansive than that, in terms of there's a lot more of my life in there. So it doesn't feel as, it's weird because in theatre, A History of Water in the Middle East feels a little bit tongue in cheek. You know that it's not actually going to be a history of water in the Middle East. Whereas with a book, if you have that title, it's immediately, people would put it in the academic section. It would be thought of as an academic book, which it's not. So then, so there's this whole world that I had the idea about, of like how you have to go about titling a book, and where people who haven't read the book are going to place it, and what they're going to think about it and stuff. So it was a long process of back and forth, trying to stay true to that original, but also bring in a little sense of what kind of tone the book would be, I suppose.
Yeah. So if you were to explain, I like asking people this question. If you were to explain what the book is about to like a 13-year-old cousin, right? So they know that you're about to do this, like this Zoom live podcast, and they're like, oh, cool, it's about your book, These Bodies of Water. Sabrina, what is the book about? And you're explaining it to like a young teenager.
The book is about the British going into the Middle East via the waterways of the region, and why all those waterways were important in a way that you would never have been taught before in sort of standard education. And then it's threaded through with my story as to how I became interested in that and why, and how that invasion of that region has impacted my own life and lots of millions of other people's lives who were not there at the time, but yet still sort of live through the legacy of all of that colonialism that is part of a world, colonialism in part of the world where I don't think we've really examined it that much in the English language. I think, and definitely not in Britain. So many people. Anyway, sorry, that's going on. That's how I'd explain it.
Well, there's also a secondary part that's funny that it didn't make it into that teenage synopsis, which is the invasion of, and so often the invasion of your body as a character in this throughout the the book. Do you feel like that's secondary to what the book's about?
No, but I've already just went to tell my 13-year-old cousin that bits are in there. Yeah, no, I don't. I think that that's like completely integral to it all, obviously, and trying to. I think I've always been interested in trying to like map that political history onto a personal history, and sort of always been really bamboozled by people who feel like those two things are completely separate. And I was just eager to put those two things together as much as possible, and not to try and draw conclusions that are like, you know, you're desperately looking for this to link with this. It just was very natural to go, oh, here's an example of, like you said, an invasion of a body of a country via a body of water, and here's an invasion of a body, or here's an invasion of the autonomy of somebody, me, or there's stories of other people as well, and just, you know, how all of those are interlinked. I think that's probably the most overused phrase in the book, is inextricably linked, because you know everything that I'm talking about in the book really is, and the violence of colonialism is inextricably linked to the violence of sexual violence, and the violence that's just across the world and our lives every day.
Yeah. It's like an exercise in like what subjugation looks like, from you know, historically, and what it still looks like today in many ways for somebody who's in service, who's actually like in service of the very subjugating force, in this case the British government. So the structure of the book, for those who are who haven't read it yet, it's built out sort of almost by country. And so for those who can't see the screen, I'll just read out the titles of the chapters. There's Harbor 1, Egypt; Tidal, Yemen; Headwaters, Bahrain; Tributaries, Kuwait; Drainage, Iraq; Evaporation, Palestine; Permeable, United Arab Emirates; Confluence, Jordan; Harbor 2, England. I'm curious if the structure of this book mimicked the structure of the stage show.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, very much so. I think every country that you've read out from the chapters was a country that was part of the stage show. So that was primarily why I chose those, because during the sort of 2-year development period of the stage show, where it was only 60 minutes and it was a performance with multiple mediums, in the performance, music and video, dance, we had to lose so much of the research, and so much of the elements that we wanted to include just didn't fit within that format. So I kind of had already got all these things that I wanted to explore further for each of those countries. And then it felt that if I added any more in, why wouldn't I add all of them in? So it kind of just became easier to say, these are the ones that I've already focused on, and very aware that it doesn't cross the entire Middle East region, if anybody has a definitive count of what that means anyway. But they are ones that have a significant historical British colonialism context, and so they kind of stayed. And they could be more, obviously, but yeah, they are from the show.
So were any of them, did you struggle to write any of the chapters in a way that sort of is an outlier? Like, do you sort of, I wonder if you sort of thought to yourself like, I guess we have to include, we got to include Kuwait, but I don't know what I would say, or we have to include, whatever. I'm not trying to pick a pick favorites, but I wonder if some came really easily too. I mean, I was reading the Yemen one right before getting on the call to remind myself, and it just like it feels like it rolls off the page, where it's like I couldn't imagine a situation where that wasn't in there.
Yeah, the Kuwait one actually was not. Kuwait is the only one that wasn't in the show.
Really?
Yeah. So that was an additional one. Well, it was in the show, but like very, very much mentioned, really as part of Iraq, and
Sure.
not really on its own with its own history. So that was hard because it was so much research, and there's really not that much written about it in the English language.
Because you mentioned like the archives got destroyed, and
Yep. So their own archives were destroyed. So many of their own archives were destroyed. And then anyone who has written about it was like a colonial officer, basically, in England. So you're kind of reading everything and then having to like actually think, but what really happened, or like what are they really talking about? So yeah, that one was tricky, actually doing that. But I still felt like it was because of that. I wanted to have at least one place that was less sort of written about in there as well, and I did think it was important. But yeah, it was harder. Anything that was heavily research based, that's not my kind of default way of writing. So that was always harder to do the research and to sift through all the like millions of things that it could be, because obviously you just choose a path, and that's what you have to do. You can't keep going off onto all the other tangents, which you could quite easily, because every single sentence there's but there's also this, or there's also that, there's also this. So you just have to put all these things in the recommended reading or in the notes, and if somebody wants to have a look at all of that stuff, then they can. But yeah, it gave me a huge respect for non-fiction writers generally, and obviously historians, for what they do, collating and filtering through all of this huge amount of information. But it also made me realize how, which I knew, but really viscerally knew now, how biased all of that is, and how we've kind of, or I anyway, as a student, a history student, kind of just absorbed all of this information as if that person had done this work with a completely objective mind, and knowing now that that's like absolutely impossible.
Let's talk a little bit about, if it's okay with you, I'd love to sort of go through each chapter slightly, just to get a sense of, I'd love to understand how you approach this. So maybe if we start with Egypt for a second, in your mind, was this the only place to start? I mean, you do the first harbor as England, but once you get to the Middle East, was this the only place to start? Like, is it how you started writing it? Is that how it all came back together?
Yeah, definitely. This was Egypt is the whole way into it all. And I mentioned in the prologue, it's interesting that Egypt is the only country of which that I was writing, or earlier in the play that I was performing things about, that I have an actual connection to. But like the English way of talking about the Middle East is so much from a European man's perspective, that I am kind of given this, not that you need permission, but I am kind of given this like, oh, you can talk about the Middle East as a whole sort of region, when actually, until I was in my 20s, the only place that I'd been was Egypt. So I find that interesting in and of itself, a region that is just so varied and completely different, of which I have no direct experience of the majority of the countries. So yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think because things are changing in terms of people realizing that actually having an entire Middle East section in the bookshop, and every single one is written by a white European man, is potentially like not what they would think is okay anymore in other regions of the world. I think it would be quite difficult to find that in any other ex-colonial region anymore. And so there's this sort of like want to bring in other voices, but at the same time it's not a big enough one, because there are obviously people who are writing and making art about all of these specific countries, but are people looking hard enough for them? They just know my work from something else, so they're like, oh, it's an easy way to invite her to do this and to do that, and then maybe not looking at the people who are specializing in Yemen, who are specializing in this and that. So people are trying, but they're not trying to the extent that they're actually trying to find all of the people who are out there. So yeah, it is quite strange, and it was quite sad when I was doing the research, just looking at the never-ending, great scholarship in a lot of ways, but just the never-ending roll call of English men's names writing about these countries. And then what was your other? So Egypt was definitely, I lived there as a kid and back and forth as an adult. So yeah, it was the place that I had to start.
And the idea of interlacing your story of, the interviews of you with the public service and the historical backlog, the background that you're sort of weaving in and out. Was that always the conceit from your mind, and that it had to be sort of part poetry, part memoir, part history, and that was the only way to get your point across?
Yeah, I think so. I think I really wanted to try to not be fixed in medium or fixed in genre, and then also, even though it needs to have some kind of structure, I really wanted it to be as free flowing as it could possibly be within that structure, which I'd kind of done with the theatre show, and I wanted to replicate with the book. A book was much harder because I'd never done one before, whereas theatre, I'd done a lot of theatre before, so it was actually just very exciting to finally do a theatre show in the way and style that I felt I'd always wanted to, but hadn't necessarily had the experience to make happen and the team to make happen, because I had the most perfect team. And so with a book, something that was already new, I'd only done anthologies prior to that and poetry books. So writing a whole book in a way that was slightly experimental and structurally was difficult. But I knew that it was the only way that I wanted to do it, which to try to weave those things in together, and for it to almost sometimes feel like, hang on a minute, am I in a poem now? Is this supposed to be a poem, or is this supposed to be an extract from something else? Or, having a little bit of confusion maybe, or at least having to look back a couple of pages and try to figure out what's going on. Yeah. I kind of wanted that to be part of it. And I guess that's just because that's how writing interests me, but also because that sort of lack of categorization, I think, is quite an important thing when you're talking about colonialism and the sort of history of categorization that was probably one of the most successful parts of colonialism that still exists today.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, it's funny hearing you talk about this, or actually I should say watching you talk about this. You have a smirk, this small little smirk as you're talking through it, which and it's obvious as you read through it that you have an undeniable sense of humor. And I can imagine that the stage show was very fun to put on and to watch people's reactions and think through, on one page you're talking about, you're quoting these absurd sentences about, the person asking you if you've ever had sex with an animal, and then a couple, later on you're talking about the experience stripping, and then later on you're talking about the experience of going, the British, they're interested in some port in Yemen and stuff like that. And the quick shifts are playful almost. They feel playful. And I could imagine that it would be a lot of fun to actually do that play. Was it fun writing it? I mean, is there a payoff? Is there a similar payoff? Or does it sort of feel like a letdown because there's no applause at the end? You can't hear the laughter.
Yeah, it's so different. I think it's really strange. There's the immediacy of theatre, even if you're not performing in it, which I don't usually perform in my theatre shows. But even if you're not, you still go and watch it, even if it's just a couple of times, and you have this immediate reaction to things. So I think I'll always prefer the feeling that you are connected with an audience as right there and then, and that what you're saying in that moment is of importance in that moment. I think with a book, it's a much more of a long-term thing, and I've never really written with a long-term. Everything that I write is always very much in that moment that I'm in, and very immediate to then. So the thought that somebody might not read the book until 2-3 years after it was written is quite strange. And obviously that happens with plays as well, but it's that initial putting it out into the world where you do get that immediate reaction back. And so I think that will be the area that I will prefer to kind of make work in, especially when it's something that I feel like it needs to be said right now.
Let's talk a little bit about the next chapter, Yemen. This stuff was very new to me. A lot of the historical background was new, just because I'm marginally ignorant about many things, but definitely about Yemen, the history of Yemen in the 19th century. How much of this was new to you? So, I'll read just the first paragraph that we have on the screen, which is like when you start talking about the historical stuff. You say, in 1839, British forces invaded Aden at the tip of what is now Yemen and forcibly took control of the area, as it was perfectly placed for them to launch attacks on the pirate ships in the Arabian Sea, which had long been attacking the British cargo ships. Importing British goods to India and exporting Indian goods to Britain was at the time what made the empire viable. These are like, I have snippets of this information in my head, but I definitely didn't have the full picture. How much of the full picture did you have going into this idea, going into writing the book and preparing the show?
I really had snippets as well. And I can't actually remember the initial way that the concept for the show. I think I'd always been very, very interested in empire, the story of British Empire, the way that we're told it, the reality of it. And over the last few years, obviously, there's been an amazing sort of production of texts that look very differently at British Empire, which has been great because you can spend a long time thinking, am I the only person who thinks this? Prior to all of that happening, it was actually still like a genuine thing to have conversations with people who they really thought that it was mostly a good thing. So
the empire,
yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that a general conversation that you've been exposed to a lot, where people think, really?
Yeah, 100%. And that's not just in like government or university. Like at university, that was very, very common. I mean, that was
thing in what way good thing? Like we are civilizing these people, or in what way a good thing?
Yeah, like look, everyone was fighting each other, and it all would have ended up really badly anyway. So at least they ended up with schools and hospitals and railways. Railways was always this big one. Like at least people have got trains, and the empires have existed since the beginning of time, and you can't just single out the British one for being particularly awful. Actually, out of all the empires, it was a good one. Blah, 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 blah. Look, everything that you've experienced is as a consequence of its positive elements with education, etc. Yeah, like you know, even people who weren't like apologists who would kind of say, yeah, no, I totally agree. It was bad, but yeah, there's always a but. So not so much in the theatre world. I think the theatre world was the first one that I got into, where most people seemed pretty anti-empire, but you know, even I would say, yeah, you're always going to encounter royalists, and I think it's quite difficult to be a royalist and also be anti-empire, like really and truly. So if so many of our arts organizations, some of which I'm a part of, you know, they are what's it called, sponsored, not sponsored, but, you know, endorsed by the royal family. They have like these royal connections to them still. It's very much part of everyday society in the UK. So as we,
it's the K stands for kingdom. So
yeah, exactly. Which it now really is. Yeah. So yes, it was great to be part of in the past 5 to 8 years. This sort of opening up of publications that dealt with a different version of empire, or a different perspective on the empire, from people who generally were from the diaspora but lived in the UK. Most people were like second generation who were writing these things, and I just felt like there was a huge gap in the Middle East of it, and so many people who were really great in their knowledge of other parts. And actually, I learned most of what I knew from India, looking at the Indian empire aspect, and Yemen came from that knowledge, from the knowledge of India, and like, well, how did India sustain it? And then how did they sustain India? And then it kind of, the Middle East was just thrown in as oh, well, they used the Suez Canal, or oh, they used this. So I guess that's what I wanted to expand on. Well, okay, there's a lot of material that we can look at about India, but then what about these other places that also were being used to maintain that? And yeah, so I was just filling in those snippets, really. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, I mean, we've been speaking for about half an hour and we haven't really spoken about water. Why is water so important? I mean, obviously, the British is known for its navy, but it's more than that.
Yeah, I think it's just the unexpectedness of it, the sort of the universality of water, of like how important it is to us all, of how neutral, I guess, water seems a lot of the time to a lot of people. Everyone feels an ownership over a piece of water. And also, I think particularly with the Middle East is how the imagery of it is so dry. And in the UK, it's been pushed so heavily via films and the news, and, you know, images that have been chosen to be of a desert, to be sand and oil, you know, the two things that we've got to think about when we think about the Middle East. And so somehow, thinking of it as a lush, verdant place full of water, it disrupts that imagery that we've been that's been forced on people who have not necessarily got much experience of the area. And it kind of, I think it does make them have to reassess why an area was invaded. I think there's something about, if an area is dry and barren and the only thing it's got going for it is oil, in a really messed up way, it makes people feel like it's more of an okay target. I don't, like, there's all these really subtle things that have been done throughout the years to make people feel like it's not that bad that this place is being invaded. It's not that bad that this conflict is happening in this place. And so just wanting to take as many of those "it's not that bad" away, even though that's not valid. It's not that bad is not valid at all. But you know, just trying to constantly ask ourselves to reassess the imagery that we have about certain places, the assumptions that we have about certain places and people, and why those exist.
So what I'm going to do, Sabrina, is I want to jump to the quick Q&A, and then we will get to maybe 2 questions from the audience, and then I'm going to let you go.
Okay, thank you.
So what are you reading these days?
Oh, actually, I'm reading. I think you had him on here. I missed it, but I need to read it, to listen to it. Midnight in Cairo by Raphael.
Oh, Raphael.
Yeah. So I'm reading that at the moment, and yeah, it's and it's such an amazing book. Really, history written in a way that I want to read it anyway.
Yeah.
You know, like a very storytelling. But very interesting historical elements that haven't, I think, been written in the English language in that way before.
Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Oh gosh. Any of the women from Midnight in Cairo, which is basically like 1920s women in Cairo cabarets. I just feel like
that goes back to your raving.
Yeah.
What do people most misunderstand about your work?
Interesting. I think the most thing that I've heard is like people making the assumption that I'm writing it for those who are from outside of my experience. I mean, obviously everybody's experience is singular, but there's an assumption that you're always writing it for someone else, whereas in my mind I'm always writing it for somebody who, like me, wanted to read something like that or see something like that. I'm never actually writing something to explain to other people like this is what this kind of life is like.
You're speaking to the 14-year-old Sabrina.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, so let's do 2 questions from the audience. I'm going to read them out. The first one, I don't know who it's from, but it's from the Greater Middle Eastern Platform in Netherlands. So it says, I'm wondering how you look at the waters, seas, etc., how the water, seas, etc., are dealt with by Western powers today. Who's taking responsibility, for example, the leaking container ship at the coast of Yemen? Do you have a sense?
No, I don't know. I have been... It was such an intense time of like staying on top of absolutely everything that was going on prior to publication to try to make it as relevant as possible in terms of the constantly changing news, that since publishing the book, I've been like, I'm not on any news forms at all. I've like not been on social media hardly at all. I've really disengaged myself from everything because it was becoming like completely overwhelming. I will go back into the news eventually, but so I really don't know much about what's happening at the moment, but taking historical consideration into account, I would say that that nobody takes responsibility when responsibility is needed to be taken, but everyone takes it when there's something to be gained from taking the area of water and saying it's under their control.
Cool. The last one that comes from Nia, I'm going to ask the second question that you asked, which is, how long did it take you to finish the book?
Well, interestingly, it's only because of COVID that the book even became a book, because my initial idea was to do a book rather than a theatre show. And then I realised like, oh, I do not have the tenacity to finish a book, so I'll just do a theatre show and that'll be fine. And then when all the theatres closed and it was like, oh, we're in a lockdown for an unknown period of time, then I realised that I could actually take some of the information. Thank you.
There it is.
I hope that
Sabrina Mahfouz, my mother.
Well,
yeah. So it took about 2 years. For 2 years of COVID.
That's the perfect ending. Well, Sabrina, thanks so much for doing this. I know you got to get off to school. Thanks so much. This book, we're going to be discussing it on the community platform in the days and weeks ahead as part of book club. Sabrina, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.